Thank you, Ann. Good afternoon, all. We're very fortunate this afternoon to have Joyce McGuinney from Lake Castles that's been our corporate law firm for decades. We're blessed to have her because she's got the depth of experience with our organization and the various constitutional changes that have occurred over the passage of time. And she knows what our existing structure is. With the new Not-for-Profit Act coming into place in October, we're going to be relying significantly on the assistance of Joyce in guiding us through continuing in the new regime. Welcome, Joyce.
First of all, I want to thank Carol and the NEC for inviting me to speak today. My history with the IODE does go back the full 25 years that I've been at Blake's. It was one of the first files I worked on. The partners involved in it have changed over the years, but I remain the constant. I've worked on your Constitution and all the changes that have happened. However, my experience with the IODE does go back somewhat further. I have told Carol and the NEC that if it weren't for the IODE, I probably wouldn't have eaten during my last year of university. I was the recipient of 2 of your bursaries that year that kept me eating and kept me at school so I could finish my degree. So thank you now, in case I didn't say it then. As I said, this is really quite revolutionary that we now have a new Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. The old act was from 1917, the same year in which the Treaty of Versailles was signed. So you can see that it was time. And it has taken a long time for a new act to be written because so many different kinds of entities are falling under the area of not-for-profit, whether it's a local hockey association, the Canadian Cancer Society, the hospitals. There are so many things, and groups like the IODE. The IODE is actually older, as you probably know, than even the old Canada Corporations Act. The thing with the old Canada Corporations Act and why we needed changes were that really it came down to 2 pages. That's all there were. There were no guidelines for the legal community as to how these should really function. Instead, everyone just wrote bylaws, constitutions, as you have, that sort of covered how people would be elected, what would happen, and of course, it didn't include things like that we now just take for granted. Telephone meetings. Who ever thought in 1917 that you'd be able to hold a telephone meeting? You had to have meetings because whoever thought that the law would say, as long as you all sign a piece of paper saying something is so, something is so. All of these things that we now just take for granted under the business corporation laws in Canada. So, finally, and this act, in 1970, they started to try and put in a new not-for-profit act. And then it went through every government that you can imagine and died on the floor. Then we thought really we were getting somewhere when government was prorogued. You may recall that little oddity in our history. So we thought, well, that's it. Now it's died again. We won't see anything. But surprisingly enough, right after the government sat again, they passed it. So October 17, 2011, we finally got a new Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. It is so dramatically different from how we have governed not-for-profits and charities in this country that they said, we can't just say, oh, everybody's now governed by this act. So instead, the government is calling for a mandatory transition. You will have to file articles of continuance. You have 3 years to do it. Good news is, we're not going to charge you. That's what the government said, no fees. We'll accept your new articles and your new bylaws, but you have to prepare these and send them in to us. And if you are a charity, as you are, you will also have to make sure that you send copies off to the Canada Revenue Agency so that they are aware that you have continued. The bad news is, if you don't continue in 3 years, we're dissolving you. You're gone. So no fooling around here, you do have to do this. And that's why the NEC and Carol asked me to come and speak to you, because you have had a long-standing constitution that goes back decades and decades and decades. And for the first time in many years, it's not going to be just putting little patches on it and changing things. Your Constitution Committee is going to have to meet and go through everything that was in your original charter documents and everything that is in your current Constitution and bylaws, and look at everything and make it work with the new act. The old regime used to call for letters patent that were actually a grant from the Queen to say, here, you can exist. I say you can exist. Now you are incorporated under this new act by right. You simply file your papers and it's stamped. It has a nice little Canadian flag on the top, and you get what's called a certificate, in your case, of continuance. Before, it used to take anywhere from 3 weeks to a month to incorporate. Now you can incorporate in a couple of days. Same thing on the continuance process. You can now continue in a couple of days. It won't take months. Those of you who have ever been on the Constitution Committee will recall that when you did have to pass changes to your Constitution, you could pass them, first the NEC, then you would take it to the membership at your annual meetings and you would approve that. Then, before you could actually act upon it, you used to have to send it to Industry Canada, and it needed to get ministerial approval. That could again take 3 months to do that. Now, none of that exists anymore. While they've said, and only because the voluntary sector has asked them, will you now follow your bylaws with them? But there's no approval process here anymore. You will file your bylaws only because you asked, and I'm using that as the broad you, as the voluntary sector, asked that they keep copies, because often that was the only place people could ever find them. They knew the government would have a copy, because as volunteers, people change, they move around, and these things sometimes got lost. The process, as I said, is going to be much simpler. You could actually amalgamate now with another organization if there were another organization that was doing similar activities. Before, that would have simply been unheard of. There are some things that are somewhat different and going to be a little bit more onerous, and this is what your treasurer will want to pay attention to. You're now going to have to actually file your financial statements with Corporations Canada within a prescribed period after they have been presented. Again, I think this is more, once again, because you have public funds involved here. This will only apply to those corporations which, like the IODE, are charitable. But you will not only have to file with the Canada Revenue Agency, you will have to file your financial statements with Corporations Canada. But that's after your annual meeting and after they've been presented. One of the other things that will affect the IODE is some of the other provisions that they have regarding, for example, no longer will you be able to have ex officio directors. All directors and leaders of your organization will need to be elected at your annual meeting by the membership. This may have some impact on how your national councillors and others work at the moment and how they're actually elected to their positions. And these are all things that, again, the Constitution Committee is going to have to go through carefully and look at to make sure that you're now compliant. So that is where we're all really glad to see some actual background here now where we can go to, so that if we do need to have something adjudicated, we can now rely on what has been common law in the business community. We will now actually have something to go to and look at. As I said, everything will be quicker, easier, much less work involved, and we will excuse me, have common legal principles that can be adequately adjudicated. Again, I just, in closing, would want to say that the one thing that you'll need to think about is you want to comply with this. You want to start moving forward now. You have a process in place because of the way your organization is formed, excuse me, that it takes a while in order to get constitutional changes through. So you need to start now, because you only have 3 years. If you haven't continued by October 16th of 2014, you will be dissolved. And if you're dissolved, all of the assets escheat to the Crown. And I'm sure the Queen would love to see your money, but I think it would be better if it stayed here and continued to support all of the good deeds, like helping Peter out here and all of the other things that you've done for me 30-odd years ago, and for others. And you know, you're to be commended for all the good works you do, and it'd be wonderful once you're under this new legislation, you can start to move forward again into the next, what, 100 and some years? Yes, another 100 and some years. Thank you very much.
Second Vice President Ann Mason will give thanks to Joyce.
Joyce, on behalf of IODE Canada, I would like to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today, to provide us with an introduction to the new Not-for-Profit Act. You make it sound so simple. I hope that is the case. We are very grateful to have you on board to guide us through this transition, making connections to the future of IODE. Thank you.